Chicago, 1893. Outside, a brutal storm lashes the streets. Inside a modest cafe near the World's Fair, a widowed waitress serves coffee in silence until a $1 million deal begins to collapse before her eyes. The powerful tycoon, the furious Russian delegation, the interpreter who suddenly falls unconscious. And then, against every rule of class and fate, Susan steps forward, revealing a secret talent that could save his empire and change her life forever. What past is she hiding? And what will it cost when duty collides with forbidden desire? Tell me in the comments where you're listening from, and what do you love most about historical romances? Chicago, in the autumn of 1893, wore the storm like a shroud. Wind howled down the narrow streets near the world's Columbian Exposition, bending lampposts and rattling window panes as if the city itself were trembling beneath the weight of its own ambition. The white city, resplendent by day, seemed distant under the bruised sky, its glow dimmed by sheets of rain that blurred the horizon. Yet life pressed on, as it always did in a place built from fire and iron and restless hope. In a modest cafe tucked beside a busy avenue, Susan Calloway moved between tables with the quiet grace of someone who had long ago learned to make herself small. Her cotton dress, dark as storm water, clung to her slender frame, the hem damp from her walk to work. A linen apron tied at her waist bore faint stains no amount of scrubbing could erase. Stray wisps of dark brown hair escaped the neat bun at the nape of her neck, softening the delicate lines of her face. Her hazel eyes, large and steady, held the calm of a woman accustomed to hardship. She spoke little but saw everything. The storm rattled the door as she carried a tray laden with steaming cups of coffee. Shadows of businessmen and laborers flickered across the cafe's walls, cast by the wavering glow of oil lamps. Outside, a carriage splashed past, horses snorting as the wind tore at their manes. Inside, the air was thick with damp wool, the scent of strong brew, and the low hum of voices speaking of railroads, markets, and the fairgrounds glittering just beyond the storm. Susan set 2 cups before a pair of clerks, murmured a polite word, and stepped back. Her heart thudded beneath her dress, not from the work but from the memory of the morning's hurried goodbye. She had left her little boy, Daniel, curled beneath a patched blanket in the care of a trusted neighbor. The image of his small body, warm and fragile, clung to her like a second skin. Each hour she spent at the cafe was an hour she prayed the world would not take more from her than it already had. A sudden pull of cold wind announced the arrival of a new party. The door swung open, and a cluster of men stepped inside, shaking rain from their coats. Their entrance shifted the entire atmosphere. They were not clerks. They were not workers. Their coats were finely tailored, their boots polished, their eyes sharp with purpose. One of them, tall and severe, motioned briskly to the staff. A private luncheon had been arranged, though no one had expected them to arrive early. The cafe owner hurried forward, rubbing his hands together with forced enthusiasm. Susan retreated to the counter, collecting clean plates with practiced efficiency. She noticed the man who led the group, the one whose presence seemed to command the storm itself. He removed his gloves slowly, revealing hands that bore no calluses, hands accustomed to contracts, not labor. His dark blonde hair was slicked back, revealing threads of silver at the temples. His blue-grey eyes, cool and unreadable, scanned the room with the precision of a man who weighed everything and wasted nothing. Henry Ashford. His name carried weight in Chicago. A magnate of railroads, a widower still whispered about in polite circles, a man whose decisions could ignite fortunes or extinguish them. He was said to be relentless, calculating, and marked by tragedy. In that moment, drenched in stormlight, he looked like a figure carved from authority itself. Susan lowered her gaze, willing her heartbeat to steady. She had served wealthy men before. They rarely saw the people who placed food before them. They certainly never saw her. The Russians arrived moments later, their fur-collared coats glistening with rain. Their heavy accents rumbled through the room like distant thunder. A translator accompanied them, a middle-aged man whose pale face and trembling hands betrayed nerves and perhaps an oncoming illness. The atmosphere thickened with tension and importance. This was no ordinary luncheon. This was a negotiation that could reshape railway lines stretching across half the nation. Susan delivered soup to the long table, careful not to disturb the papers spread before the men. She caught fragments of English, Russian, and business jargon. Words like investment, expansion, and millions whispered like fragile promises. Then the translator swayed. It happened slowly at first. His hand hesitated over a document. His voice faltered mid-sentence. His breath rasped shallowly. Susan paused at the edge of the room, watching as one of the Russians leaned forward, irritation sharpening his features. Henry's eyes narrowed. The translator coughed once, twice, then collapsed onto the floor. Chairs scraped, voices rose. Confusion rippled through the cafe as the interpreter was lifted into a chair, pale as parchment. The Russians, offended and impatient, began speaking among themselves, their tone clipped and distrustful. Henry tried to salvage order, demanding someone fetch a doctor, but the Russians insisted the meeting could not continue without proper translation. They stood as if preparing to leave, and in that moment Susan felt time slow. She heard their indignation. She recognized every word. Her grandmother's voice echoed faintly in her memory. Old lullabies, proverbs, prayers whispered in Russian long before life had hardened into survival. Those memories had become a private refuge, a part of herself she never revealed. But now, those words were the only thing standing between order and ruin. She stepped forward. "Excuse me," she said softly, her voice trembling only at first. "If it would help, I can translate." The room froze. Henry turned, his gaze striking hers with the force of a cold wind. The Russians stared in disbelief. Even the cafe owner blinked as if he had misheard her. Susan straightened her spine, though her heart pounded so fiercely she feared they might see it through her dress. She repeated her offer, in Russian. A stunned silence followed. Then one of the Russians nodded slowly, skepticism softened by curiosity. Henry studied her with new eyes, as if seeing a figure who had stepped unexpectedly out of shadow and into his world. For a breathless moment, their gazes locked. Something unspoken passed between them. A flicker of astonishment, a spark of recognition, a sense of a storm within a storm. "Very well," Henry murmured, his voice low. "Let her speak." What followed unfolded in a blur of words and careful intonation. Susan translated with steady clarity, mediating each phrase with precision and instinct. She softened harsh edges, clarified misunderstandings, and rebuilt the delicate bridge collapsing between the parties. The Russians relaxed. Henry leaned closer, listening intently not only to the negotiation, but to the woman who carried it on her quiet shoulders. When at last the final agreement was spoken aloud, when the Russians nodded in cautious satisfaction, when the meeting resumed its rhythm, Susan let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. The storm beyond the windows had eased, though thunder still grumbled in the distance. Henry dismissed the Russians with a respectful nod, then turned to Susan. His expression, once carved from stone, now revealed a glimmer of something warmer, something unexpectedly human. "You saved a negotiation worth more than I care to admit," he said quietly. "I cannot allow talent like yours to remain hidden in a cafe." Susan lowered her gaze, her hands twisting nervously in her apron. "I only did what was needed, sir." He paused. For the first time, his voice softened. "I would like to offer you a temporary position as my interpreter for the duration of these negotiations." A beat of silence. "I believe the opportunity may benefit us both." Her breath caught. The offer shimmered like a fragile miracle, hope wrapped in danger. She thought of Daniel, of rent due, of the thin line between survival and collapse. She also thought of the risk. The world of men like Henry Ashford had already taken too much from her, yet she lifted her chin, feeling the storm within her find its direction. "For my son's sake," she whispered, "I accept." Outside, the rain began again, soft at first, then rising into a steady, relentless rhythm, as if the sky itself understood that nothing in Susan Calloway's life would ever be the same again. The morning that followed her unexpected ascension into Henry Ashford's world was sharp with October chill. A fine mist clung to the streets of Chicago, like a breath that would not release, and beneath it the city glimmered with ambition and unease. Streetcars rattled past like iron insects, and the glow of gas lamps flickered behind drawn curtains. The world's Columbian Exposition stood proudly in the distance, a white marvel of steel and stone. But Susan Calloway's gaze was fixed on the more immediate terrain, the looming granite building at the corner of State Street, crowned in black slate and quiet judgment, Ashford and Company. Its windows gleamed, tall and narrow, reflecting the shifting sky above the city, like the eyes of a giant that never slept. Susan stood before its door, her gloved hands clasped tightly around the handle of a borrowed reticule. She wore a modest walking dress in dove grey, its lines clean, its wool freshly brushed. A straw hat, simple and without adornment, shielded her neatly pinned hair. Every inch of her had been scrubbed and starched into anonymity, and yet she felt the weight of every gaze that might pass her by, imagined or not, like 1,000 stones pressing into her spine. When she entered, the change in temperature struck her first. Inside the building, the air was scented with pipe smoke, ink, and expensive polish. Men's voices echoed from distant corridors, low, clipped, sure of their place in the world. She passed through the tiled vestibule, her boots muffled by a plush runner, and was met by a secretary whose eyes flicked from her face to her hands to her hem in less than a breath. "Miss Calloway?" the woman asked, her voice cool as the marble floors. Susan nodded. "This way." They ascended a narrow flight of stairs, and with each step, Susan felt herself climbing into a world not made for women like her. A world of contracts, ledgers, languages wrapped in iron. She was shown to a modest office beside Mr. Ashford's private suite. The room was tidy, practical, a wooden desk, a stack of correspondence, 2 hard-backed chairs, and a narrow window that overlooked the avenue. On the desk, she saw an inkwell already prepared, a fountain pen, and a brass key to the drawer. The gesture was not ostentatious, but it struck her with its quiet meaning. She was not merely a temporary visitor. She was being given trust. When the secretary departed, Susan removed her gloves and sat. Her fingers hovered over the pen, her breath trembled, and for a moment her thoughts slipped unbidden to Daniel, his face flushed with sleep, his small arms wrapped around his worn rabbit. She whispered a silent promise to the boy, who had already lost too much. "I will not fail you." Before she could organize her papers, the door to Mr. Ashford's office opened. He stepped through without announcement, as if formality had no place between them. "Good morning," he said. His voice had the same depth as it had the day before, calm, low, unwavering, but now it was softened by a quiet awareness of her presence. He no longer looked through her, but at her, with the attention of a man who had discovered value in an unexpected place. "Good morning, Mr. Ashford," she replied, standing instinctively. "No need to rise," he murmured. "This is your office now." He handed her a folder, several translated communications from the Russian delegation. As she opened it, their fingers brushed, briefly, accidentally. But it was enough to ripple through her nerves like the flicker of a candle in a dark room. "There's a meeting with the Russians at 3, he continued, his tone composed. "You'll accompany me." She nodded, her voice steady despite the quickening of her pulse. "Of course." He paused, his eyes searching hers for something she couldn't name. Then, without another word, he returned to his suite, the door closing behind him with a gentle click. The hours passed in measured silence. Susan read, translated, prepared. Yet all the while, she felt the air around her shift, subtle currents of curiosity and resistance. A woman in the office across the hall, with golden curls and a mouth pinched into perpetual disdain, passed by Susan's door 3 times without speaking. A junior associate glanced through the glass wall with a raised brow, whispering something to a colleague. Their expressions said what their lips did not. A woman in his wing, a waitress. How quaint! But Susan had endured harsher judgment from women with colder eyes. What mattered was the work, the numbers, the contracts, the accuracy of her words, and the clarity of her mind. What mattered was Daniel. That afternoon, she joined Henry in the carriage bound for the Russian consulate. She sat beside him in silence, her gloved hands folded neatly in her lap. The horses' hooves clattered over cobblestones, and outside the fog rolled over the streets like a dream half-remembered. "I imagine the others are not welcoming," he said suddenly, his eyes on the window. Susan turned to him, uncertain how to respond. "They don't need to be," she said quietly. "I'm not here to be welcomed." His mouth twitched, almost a smile. "You may be surprised how quickly usefulness silences society." She met his gaze then, and for a breathless instant, neither looked away. At the consulate, her translations were met with admiration. One of the Russian delegates, an older gentleman with a silver beard and sharp, sea-colored eyes, addressed her directly, bypassing Henry entirely. "You were not born into this world," he said in Russian, "but you walk through it like someone who has nothing to prove." Susan bowed her head. "That is because I do." The man laughed, deep and approving. Henry, watching from beside her, said nothing, but the faint tilt of his mouth betrayed pride. When they returned to the office, dusk had begun to fall. Susan gathered her belongings, prepared to leave unnoticed, but Henry intercepted her by the staircase. "Miss Calloway." She turned. He hesitated. For the first time, he seemed uncertain, not in business, but in something far more fragile. "I wanted to say," his voice dropped to something quieter, "you did well today, not only in language, but in presence." The compliment so simply given struck her like a hand to the heart. "Thank you, sir." He looked as if he might say more, then stopped himself. As she stepped into the street, the wind pulled at her shawl. Lights shimmered in the puddles, and the white city in the distance glowed like a phantom in the fog. Susan wrapped her arms around herself, walking briskly toward home. Behind her, in the shadows of the building, another figure watched. Jefferson Ward stood beneath the awning of his private club across the avenue, his expression unreadable as he observed the young woman who had caused so much quiet noise in so little time. He drew deeply from a cigar, the smoke curling like a serpent around his lips. Beside him, an associate whispered her name, confirming the rumors. "Susan Calloway." Ward narrowed his eyes. "Calloway, is it?" he murmured. "We'll see." And with that, the game began. By the second week of Susan Calloway's employment under Henry Ashford, the autumn air had grown sharper, laced with the earthy scent of fallen leaves and chimney smoke. The city of Chicago pulsed with ambition beneath skies thick with low-hanging clouds, and at the heart of its churning elegance, Susan moved with a quiet precision that defied her humble origins. Inside the offices of Ashford and Company, her presence had become a fixed point, no longer the subject of every whisper, but a constant nonetheless. She arrived before sunrise and left only after the day's final correspondence had been copied, translated, and sealed. Her modest dresses, always freshly pressed, always in muted hues, contrasted with the ornate fashions of society women who occasionally flitted through the building like exotic birds. Yet it was Susan who was invited to the table when the Russian delegates arrived. It was her voice they waited to hear. Her translations they trusted. The Russians had grown increasingly guarded as the negotiations progressed. What had begun as cordial now trembled with the weight of vast sums, national pride, and uncertain alliances. Missteps were no longer tolerated. Every word mattered. And Susan, with her calm demeanor and finely tuned ear, became the silent axis around which the entire deal revolved. Henry had begun meeting with her privately to review each day's documents, and these encounters, once strictly professional, had begun to change. The air between them held an almost imperceptible tension, like the hush that precedes a thunderstorm, not dangerous, but full of promise and dread in equal measure. That Thursday evening, after the other offices had emptied and the lamps had been lit, Henry summoned her to the private study he used on the top floor, a room rarely entered by anyone else. She climbed the stairs with a sense of unease, not fear, but something quieter and more dangerous. Anticipation. When she entered, she found him standing near the window, his silhouette framed by the pale haze of city light. He did not turn immediately. "The Russians have requested an addendum," he said after a moment. "They want clarification on the wording surrounding raw material rights." "I've seen their notes," she replied gently, setting her notebook on the table. "They fear the phrasing could be interpreted as relinquishing long-term control." He nodded, exhaling slowly. "They're not wrong." She waited, pen in hand, but he did not continue. Instead, he crossed to the table and sat, his eyes shadowed by fatigue and something more complex, something sorrowful. "I once believed that words were the most dangerous currency a man could spend," he murmured. "But now I wonder if it isn't silence." Susan didn't speak. She knew instinctively that he was not talking about the Russians. He looked at her then, his gaze heavier than usual. "I never told you about my wife." The statement floated between them, as startling as a confession. Susan's breath caught, but she did not move. "She died 6 years ago," he said, his voice low. "A fever, swift and merciless. We were married for 9 years, no children, only silence after." Susan lowered her eyes. "I'm sorry." Henry leaned back in his chair, watching the flickering shadows cast by the gaslight. "People assume I buried myself in work out of duty. The truth is, I buried myself in it because I feared what would rise if I didn't." A silence fell, deep and unbroken. Then gently, he added, "You remind me of her, not in form but in quietness, in strength unspoken." Susan felt the words like a hand pressed gently to her spine, unexpected, reverent, dangerous. She looked up, their eyes met, and in that glance, something passed between them that could not be named. No kiss, no touch, only stillness and breath, hearts pounding beneath linen and wool. It would have been so easy to surrender to the warmth, to the vulnerability carved into the space between them. But Susan stepped back. "I should review the new terms," she whispered. He said nothing, only nodded, slowly, the storm in his eyes settling into stillness. She gathered her things and left without another word. Outside, the wind had picked up, tugging at the edges of her shawl. Her cheeks burned, though not from the cold. She walked with purpose, turning sharply down an alley she used as a shortcut on nights when time pressed against her chest like a stone. It was there, beneath the flickering lamplight, that she heard his voice. "Miss Calloway." She turned sharply, breath caught, heart racing. Jefferson Ward stepped from the shadows with a smile too polished to be sincere. "My apologies for the dramatic entrance," he said, adjusting his gloves, "but I find certain conversations are best held in private." Susan's fingers tightened around her satchel. "Mr. Ward," he tipped his hat, "I've been watching your progress. Quite impressive. Rising so quickly in Mr. Ashford's favor, it's a rare thing to gain that man's trust." "I earned it," she said calmly. "Oh, of that I have no doubt." His smile never wavered. "But as you surely know, rising quickly in this city often invites attention." She remained silent. Ward stepped closer, his voice low. "It's remarkable, truly, how little there is on record about a Miss Susan Calloway before this year. So few documents, so few ties. Almost as if she didn't exist until she stepped into that cafe." Susan's breath hitched. He watched her carefully. "Now, of course, I understand. Sometimes a woman must reinvent herself for the sake of her child, for safety. But the law? Well, the law doesn't always look kindly on such reinventions." A silence bloomed between them, thick, suffocating. "What do you want?" she asked at last. He shrugged. "I only came to offer a friendly warning. There are people who would be concerned to learn that a key figure in these delicate negotiations has not been entirely forthcoming about her past. Names changed, records blurred, custody matters unresolved. I've broken no laws," she said, though her voice trembled. "Perhaps, but appearances, Miss Calloway, they are everything, especially when millions are at stake." He offered a small, mocking bow. "Do take care." And with that, he disappeared into the fog. Susan stood frozen, her hands shaking, her eyes stinging with cold and fury. Her past, like a shadow long outrun, had found her once more. She wrapped her shawl tightly around her shoulders and continued down the alley, her steps faster now, every echo ringing like a threat. Inside her small apartment, Daniel slept peacefully, his breath soft and steady beneath the worn quilt. She knelt beside him, resting her forehead against his tiny hand, grounding herself in the only truth that mattered. "They will not take you from me." Outside, the city slept fitfully, the wind clawing at the shutters, and in the highest offices of Ashford and Company, a single lamp still burned. Henry stood alone at the window, watching the street below, unaware that the storm he feared had already begun. Chicago glittered that evening as if determined to forget the cold. Gas lamps cast golden halos over the wide avenues, leading toward the world's Columbian Exposition, where the white city shone beneath the night sky like a dream carved from alabaster and fire. Carriages glided across the damp streets, their wheels cutting soft arcs through the mist, and elegant figures hurried beneath parasols toward the grand pavilion, where the Russian delegation would host its diplomatic gala. Susan Calloway had never imagined she would one day stand before such a place. The invitation had arrived earlier that week, a formal card embossed with gilded lettering, addressed not to Ashford and Company, but specifically to her. She had stared at it for a long moment, certain it must have been misdelivered. When she brought it to Henry, he simply nodded as though it were the most natural thing in the world. "They requested your presence," he had said. "They trust you. And so do I." She had been unable to reply. Trust was a fragile word, and in her world it could collapse with the slightest pressure. Now, as she stepped from a hired carriage onto the paved promenade, Susan's heart thudded beneath her modest evening dress. A gown borrowed from the secretary whose softer features had, surprisingly, warmed to her. The dress was simple, made of deep blue satin with a high neckline and long fitted sleeves. A thin ribbon of pearlescent trim decorated its bodice, though the fabric had been mended more than once. Her dark hair was pinned carefully, though not extravagantly, into an elegant, low twist. No jewels adorned her. No silk gloves hid her hands. She looked neither like the heiresses who swept past her, nor the wives of ambassadors wrapped in velvet and diamonds. Yet she carried herself with dignity, even as she felt the eyes of strangers glide over her like invisible blades. Henry was waiting for her near the entrance, dressed in a black frock coat that fit him with austere perfection. His crisp white collar and deep burgundy cravat softened the severity of his attire. The candlelight above them illuminated the faint silver at his temples, giving him an air of seasoned authority. When he saw her, something in his expression changed, not openly but subtly, like a tide shifting beneath a tranquil surface. "You look lovely," he said. Her breath caught. "Thank you, sir." He offered his arm. She hesitated for only a moment before placing her hand lightly upon it. The warmth beneath his sleeve was startling, as if he carried a fire under his skin. They stepped inside together. The ballroom unfolded like a living jewel box, crystal chandeliers dripping with light, marble floors gleaming beneath the dance of silk and lace, and an orchestra tuned in a corner, their instruments whispering the promise of a waltz. The Russian delegation stood near the head of the room, conversing animatedly in their mother tongue, though their eyes sparkled with interest when they saw Susan. Almost immediately she felt the ripple of whispers. "She's the interpreter, isn't she?" From a cafe. How quaint. Henry noticed. His jaw tightened, though he said nothing. Instead, he guided her toward the delegation with quiet assurance. Susan Calloway, one of the dignitaries, greeted her warmly in Russian, taking her hand between his own. We are honored by your presence. Her cheeks warmed. The honor is mine. Another Russian lifted his glass. Your translations have saved us many headaches, and perhaps saved your Mr. Ashford from losing the last of his patients. The men laughed, and even Henry's lips twitched with reluctant amusement. For a brief, hopeful moment, Susan felt at ease. That peace shattered when the crowd parted, revealing a young woman gliding toward them with the predatory grace of a jeweled serpent. Lillian Davenport, heiress to a banking empire, celebrated beauty of Chicago's social elite, and one of the few people who could speak to Henry as an equal, though he rarely bothered to return the favor. Her gown was an opulent cascade of emerald silk. Her hair was curled and adorned with pearls. Her smile was sharp as ice. "Henry," she purred, ignoring Susan entirely, "I had hoped you would attend." He inclined his head politely. "Miss Davenport, and you've brought company." Lillian's eyes finally swept toward Susan, assessing her from head to toe. "How charming." Susan's spine stiffened, though she forced a courteous smile. "Good evening." Lillian returned the expression with a sweetness so brittle it looked as though it might shatter. "My dear, that dress, how refreshing to see someone willing to embrace simplicity. It's rather brave considering the setting." One of the Russians bristled. Henry's gaze sharpened like a blade drawn from its sheath. "It suits her perfectly," he said, each word deliberate. "Elegance does not require extravagance." Lillian's expression flickered, annoyance concealed beneath a practiced smile. She turned her attention back to Henry. "Are you free for a dance later? I was hoping—" "No," he said. "I am not." He did not offer an explanation, he did not soften the blow, and he did not remove Susan's hand from his arm. Lillian's cheeks flushed crimson. She excused herself with brittle grace and disappeared into the crowd. The Russians exchanged amused glances. Susan, mortified, tried to step away, but Henry's arm remained firm beneath her fingertips. "Do not move," he murmured. "You did nothing wrong." "I shouldn't be here," she whispered, her voice trembling. These people," he interrupted gently, "have no authority to decide your worth." Her heart fluttered painfully. She lowered her gaze, afraid he might see too much in her eyes. Later that night, after hours of translating light conversation and diplomatic pleasantries, Susan excused herself to take in the cool air on the veranda. The night was crisp, the moon half-veiled behind drifting clouds. She leaned against the marble railing, releasing the tension held tight in her shoulders. She did not hear Henry approach until he stood beside her. "Are you well?" he asked softly. "Yes." A lie. "I only needed a moment." He watched her, his gaze heavy with unspoken concern. "You handled yourself with grace," he said, "more grace than those born into this world." She exhaled, her breath trembling in the cold. "I don't belong here. You belong exactly where you stand." The words settled around her like a warm cloak. For a moment, the world felt impossibly small, only the two of them beneath the moonlit sky, their breaths mingling with the drifting mist. "Henry," she whispered, then caught herself. "Mr. Ashford." He stepped closer. His presence enveloped her, not with force, but with warmth, with something she had not felt since before her world collapsed. Safety, hope, the promise of something beyond survival. She wanted to tell him everything, about her past, about her in-laws, about the name she no longer had the right to claim. She wanted to confess her fear, her shame, her longing to keep what little she had built, but the words dissolved on her tongue. "I should return inside," she murmured. His jaw tightened with unspoken disappointment, but he nodded. "As you wish." She left him on the veranda, her heart pounding painfully. Across the ballroom, hidden in the shadow of a marble column, Jefferson Ward watched her leave. His expression was patient, calculating, almost amused. Beside him, a man in a dark coat handed him a folder, slim, bound in string, containing documents stamped with official-looking seals. Ward slid one paper halfway out. It bore a name, not Susan Calloway, another name entirely. Ward smiled. Perfect. He slid the forged documents back into the folder and tucked it beneath his arm. Then he turned toward the ballroom with the slow satisfaction of a hunter who had finally found the scent of prey. And Susan, unaware of the storm now moving steadily toward her, stepped back into the sparkling light of the gala, where laughter, champagne, and chandeliers hid the truth that nothing would ever be the same again. The cold settled over Chicago with a merciless certainty, the kind of cold that crept beneath doors and through seams in the walls, stealing warmth as easily as a thief steals coins from an unlocked drawer. By the first week of November, frost rimmed the windows of Ashford and Company, turning their panes into fragile mirrors that reflected the busyness of the streets beyond. Yet inside, the air carried a tension far sharper than the winter wind. It began with a letter. A single envelope, cream-colored and deceptively plain, addressed to Susan in a hand she had once prayed she would never see again. It arrived early in the morning, delivered by a messenger who spoke her name with the indifference of someone carrying a dozen letters a day. Susan accepted it with numb fingers, her heartbeat thudding in her ears. She knew before opening it, some instincts never dulled, especially those forged in fear. She broke the seal, read the words, and felt her entire world tilt. Her in-laws had returned, the people who had once blamed her for their son's death, who had tried to wrench Daniel from her arms while grief still stained her dress, now demanded a meeting. They claimed she had deceived the court, hidden her true identity. They intended to pursue custody with renewed vigor, and they would not back down. The letter trembled in her hands. For a long moment, she could not breathe. Her son's small face, peaceful in sleep that very morning, rose before her mind with a clarity that undid her. She pressed the heel of her hand against her mouth to keep a sob from escaping. Not here, not at the office. But as she stepped into her small workspace, her composure cracked once more. She closed the door and leaned back against it, one hand clutching the letter as though it were capable of poisoning the air. She needed to resign. Immediately. It was the only way to protect Daniel. The further she remained entwined with Henry Ashford's business, the faster her secret would unravel, especially now that Jefferson Ward prowled the edges of her life like a wolf scenting vulnerability. She steadied herself, then sought Henry in his private office. She knocked once softly. "Come in." His voice, deep and steady, carried through the wood. She entered, her heart in her throat. Henry looked up from his papers. The morning light painted half his face in gold, the other half in shadow. He had removed his coat and rolled his shirt sleeves to his elbows, revealing strong forearms lightly dusted with gold hair. He looked both powerful and tired, a man carrying an empire on his shoulders, yet still somehow carved with gentleness. "Susan," he said, his tone softening, "you're pale. Is everything all right?" "No," she whispered. She held out the letter. Henry stood immediately and took it from her hands. As he read, the muscle in his jaw flexed, the line of his mouth tightening with a restrained fury. "They're threatening custody," he said, voice low. "Yes. And they claim your identity." "Yes." Henry stepped closer. "Why didn't you tell me you were in danger?" "Because telling you would mean admitting everything. Because admitting everything would destroy the fragile safety I've managed to build. Because once the truth comes out, you will regret ever trusting me." But she said none of that. "I didn't want to burden you," she murmured. He shook his head, disbelief flickering in his eyes. "A burden, Susan, the work you've done here, your intelligence, your precision, it has held these negotiations together. You are not a burden. You are indispensable." She felt something inside her twist painfully at his words. He extended his hand, as though reaching for her arm. She took one step back, I need to resign, she whispered. The room went still. The ticking of the clock on his mantelpiece grew impossibly loud. No, Henry said, you don't understand. I understand perfectly. His voice deepened with resolve. I will not allow you to walk away because of fear. Her breath caught. If I stay, Daniel could be taken from me. He stepped closer, closing half the distance between them. If you leave, you lose the only ally powerful enough to help you keep him. Her eyes burned. She shook her head. You can't help me. You don't know what they're capable of. Then tell me, he said gently. Let me stand with you. His closeness weakened her knees. The sincerity in his gaze, the fierce protectiveness, the warmth radiating from him, all of it threatened to undo the wall she had built brick by brick around her heart. But she could not tell him, because telling Henry would confirm every doubt the Russian delegation whispered in the hallways, would give Jefferson Ward ammunition, would unravel her position completely. I can't, she said. He inhaled sharply as though struck. For a moment a flicker of vulnerability crossed his features, quickly concealed by resolve. You're frightened, he murmured, but you are not alone. Not anymore. Her lips parted, but no sound emerged. The moment stretched, weighted by emotion so thick it blurred the edges of the room. Henry reached for her again, slowly, giving her time to pull away. When his fingertips brushed her forearm through the thin wool of her sleeve, her breath hitched. The contact was light, barely there, but it sent a tremor through her body that left her breathless. Susan, he murmured. Her name on his lips carried warmth, reverence, longing. Then a knock shattered the moment. Henry stepped back quickly, clearing his throat. His expression regained its stoic composure mere seconds before the door opened. One of the secretaries peeked inside. Mr. Ashford, the Russian delegates have arrived. They seem troubled. Troubled. Troubled meant gossip had reached them. Rumors, threats, doubt. Troubled meant Ward's poison had begun to seep into cracks she had not even realized were exposed. Henry straightened. Tell them I'll be there in a moment. The secretary left. Henry turned to Susan, his voice firm but not unkind. Stay close to me during this meeting. Do not leave my side. She nodded, though her pulse hammered wildly. The meeting was tense. The Russians exchanged glances, their questions growing sharper. One of them shifted uncomfortably whenever the subject of trust arose. Another hinted delicately at concerns raised by external sources. Her throat tightened. Ward, always Ward. Henry sensed their unease and kept his responses measured, his tone calm. But as the meeting progressed, he looked to Susan more frequently, relying on her translations, letting her soft voice navigate the storm brewing beneath their words. When they concluded hours later, the tension had not broken. Henry signaled for Susan to follow him into the privacy of his office. As soon as the door closed behind them, he faced her squarely. What are they talking about? He demanded quietly. What rumors? What truth are you refusing to tell me? His tone was not angry. It was pained, worried, determined. Susan's stomach twisted. She looked down, unable to meet his eyes. I cannot tell you, she whispered. You cannot, he repeated, stepping closer, or you will not. Her eyes stung, her hands trembled. She swallowed hard. I must protect Daniel, she said, voice cracking. If I speak the truth, everything falls apart. Henry's expression shifted in an instant, from frustration to something softer, more devastating, understanding, and heartache. He approached her slowly, as if afraid she might shatter. His hand rose as though he wished to touch her cheek, but stopped mere inches from her skin. The hesitation was as intimate as the touch would have been. Susan, he said, voice like velvet and fire, whatever it is you're hiding, you don't have to face it alone. She closed her eyes, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. He remained before her, motionless yet burning with unspoken emotion. For a moment, it felt as though the world had narrowed to the space between their breaths. Then the door opened abruptly. A clerk entered. startled to find the two standing so close. He stammered an apology and explained that Jefferson Ward had requested an urgent private audience with Henry. Susan stepped back immediately, wiping her tears. Henry looked torn between duty and something far more personal. He opened his mouth, perhaps to ask her to stay, perhaps to offer comfort, but she shook her head. "I'll be in my office," she whispered. She left before he could stop her. Down the hallway, out of sight, she pressed a hand to her pounding heart. She had not told him, could not tell him, but each hour she remained silent. The threat grew tighter, coiling around her like a noose. And somewhere in the city, Ward sharpened his lies, gathering forged documents and venomous whispers, preparing to strike. Susan returned to her desk, closed her eyes, and prayed the truth would not cost her everything she had begun to cherish, especially him. The scent of iron filled the air before they even reached the mill. It was not the clean scent of polished steel, but the heavy metallic weight of rust, soot, and smoke, of something living and dying at once. The sky above the south branch of the Chicago River hung low and grey. Its light filtered through a haze of factory ash. Towering smokestacks belched dark clouds into the heavens, and the relentless clamour of industry echoed across the waterfront like a battlefield without respite. Henry Ashford had not set foot in the Iron Hill foundry in nearly 2 years. He had built it, owned it, financed its expansion, but its day-to-day life had long belonged to overseers and managers whose reports never included the smell of blood or the heat that clawed the skin from a man's bones. Yet that morning, when the telegram came, when the words fatality, collapse, investigation pending arrived in black ink on pale paper, Susan had not waited for instruction. She had gone to him, not as a translator, not as an employee, but as a woman who had once seen her husband buried after a factory fire and who refused to see another life swallowed by smoke. "We have to go," she had said, her voice as steady as her hands were trembling. "We have to see it." Now, seated beside her in the open carriage, Henry said nothing. His face was pale, his jaw set. His gloved hands gripped his cane more tightly than necessary. He wore his black coat buttoned high against the wind, but no fabric could shield him from the truth of where they were going. They passed rows of soot-streaked tenements, laundry frozen on the lines, children with hollow eyes playing in alleys of slush and broken wood. Susan watched the landscape shift from polished city centre to the raw bones of the industrial South. The transformation was sobering and familiar. When they arrived, a foreman met them at the gate with a hard hat in hand and an expression carved from stone. "Mr. Ashford," the man said stiffly. "Miss Calloway." The fact that he knew her name gave her pause. This way. The foundry loomed ahead. An iron beast of sweating walls and ceaseless noise. The smell of oil clung to everything. Men moved like shadows through corridors of steel, their faces smeared with coal, their eyes darting sideways as the owner of it all entered their domain. The foreman led them to the collapsed platform, where a smouldering heap of twisted metal remained half cordoned off with rope. A dark stain marked the concrete below, washed but not clean. "2 dead," the foreman said gruffly. 5 injured. 1 still missing. Henry's face turned ashen. "How?" "Support beam snapped. Was reported as weak 3 weeks ago. No repair order filed." Henry's gaze sharpened. "And who received the report?" The man looked away. Susan stepped forward, her voice calm but clear. "Was anyone on the night shift supervisor team dismissed recently?" "Aye," the foreman said reluctantly. "One last week. Said he was questioning safety costs. Got replaced with someone cheaper." Henry closed his eyes briefly. The foreman stiffened, expecting fury. But when Henry opened his eyes, his voice was quiet. "Show me the records." They walked deeper into the foundry, down corridors that reeked of sweat and suffering. Susan followed in silence, but her heart pounded. This was the world her husband had died in. This was the world she had fled with Daniel in her arms, bloodied and terrified. And now She was back, beside a man with the power to change it. In the office, she sifted through reports while Henry spoke to supervisors. The language of industry lay before her. Purchase orders, inspection logs, letters of complaint, memos buried under layers of bureaucracy. She read with the urgency of someone chasing a ghost, and when she found the complaint signed by the dismissed foreman, dated, ignored, her throat tightened. She turned to Henry and placed the page before him. "They knew," she said. His face hardened. "And they did nothing." He ran a hand through his hair, dislodging the perfect slick of oil. "This is my fault." She shook her head. "It's not your failure. It's the result of your absence." He looked at her then, not with anger, but with something deeper, shame and sorrow. "I thought delegation was the mark of a strong leader," he said. "I thought distance would keep me from seeing this." "It kept you from seeing them," Susan replied softly. "The men who carry your empire on their backs." Silence fell. Then, without another word, he turned to the foreman and ordered a full audit of safety procedures, a compensation package for the victims' families, and the reinstatement of the dismissed supervisor. Susan watched him, and for the first time saw not only a man of wealth, but a man capable of change. By the time they returned to the city, the sky had begun to darken with a storm that mirrored the gathering trouble within their walls. For while Henry had been facing the truth of his empire, Jefferson Ward had been preparing a weapon. The following morning, a report surfaced. Printed copies, delivered to Russian delegates, to board members, to reporters still sniffing around the accident site. It bore the official Ashford seal and claimed the faulty repairs had been approved and signed off by Susan Calloway. The signature was forged, the language twisted to imply incompetence. The final paragraph blamed linguistic misinterpretation for the oversight. The implication was clear. She was the failure. When Henry received the document, he stormed into her office with it in hand. "Susan," he said, his voice sharp, "have you seen this?" She read it, slowly, her hands clenched tighter with each word. "It's false," she whispered. "I never approved anything. That report never came to my desk." Henry exhaled, pinching the bridge of his nose. "I know. It's a fabrication." He looked up. "Ward!" She nodded. "And it's only the beginning." Together they reviewed the paper again. The phrasing was precise, legalistic, enough to raise questions, but too slippery to disprove at a glance. The timing, too, was calculated, just as the Russians were growing hesitant, just as the press began whispering. Susan traced the seal with her fingertip. "I can prove it's forged," she said. "The stamp is slightly off-center. It's from a batch destroyed in the spring. And the language, this word here, liaison, that's never used in our documents. We always say intermediary." Henry's eyes widened. "You remember that level of detail?" "I have to." For a long moment he stared at her, not with suspicion, but with awe. "You are remarkable," he murmured. She blushed, lowering her gaze. "But it won't matter unless we expose him," she added. "We need to trace it to his hand." He nodded. "Then we begin now." Outside, the storm broke, rain lashing against the glass like a warning. Inside, two allies sat across from one another, their faces pale with worry, their minds already racing. And somewhere in the city, Ward smiled behind a glass of brandy, unaware that the woman he thought to ruin had just begun to fight. The summons arrived at dawn, sealed in pale blue wax and stamped with the insignia of the Cook County Courthouse. Susan held it in her trembling hands, the weight of it heavier than any iron rail or steel beam ever forged in Henry Ashford's empire. The paper was thin, but its words sliced through her breath like a blade. Her in-laws had filed a new petition. They claimed that Daniel was being raised under a false identity, that Susan Calloway did not legally exist, that the boy's future was at risk in the hands of a woman who had fled her name, her past, and the court itself. They cited moral instability, fraudulent behavior, and exposure to unfit environments. What they truly meant was poverty. independence, shame. By midday, the news had spread across the city in hushed tones and slanted gazes. The Russians received word through back channels, their questions sharpened by curiosity and mistrust. The press, already stirred by the recent foundry accident, began circling like vultures over a battlefield not yet bloodied. Susan said nothing. She sat in her office with the door closed, the summons folded neatly on her desk beside a cup of tea gone cold. Her fingers rested on the edge of the table, as still as porcelain. Her thoughts were not of the hearing, not of the newspapers, not even of her in-laws. They were of Daniel. She had kissed his forehead that morning before leaving, tucking the worn quilt higher over his shoulders. He had murmured in his sleep. His small fingers curled around the hem of her sleeve, as if sensing the storm gathering just beyond the door. That night, she would hold him closer. She would protect him with every breath left in her body. When Henry entered without knocking, she did not lift her eyes. "I heard," he said quietly. She nodded. "They want to take him from you," he added, as if needing to speak the words aloud to believe them. "Yes." Henry stepped closer, then paused. "You need someone in that courtroom." She looked up, eyes rimmed in quiet fire. "I have no legal standing. They'll say I deceived the system by using a false name, that I changed Daniel's last name without consent, and they'll be right." He shook his head. "They will not be just." The silence between them grew thick with unsaid things. Then, quietly, firmly, Henry added, "I'll go with you." Her eyes widened. "You can't. I must. This could destroy your reputation, and letting you stand alone would destroy mine." She looked away, her throat tightening. She did not thank him. He would not have wanted that. The hearing took place in a courtroom that smelled faintly of old wood, ink, and damp wool. The ceiling arched high above, as if it might contain justice itself. The judge, a narrow-faced man with grey whiskers and spectacles perched low on his nose, looked down from his bench with the calm detachment of a man used to deciding fates before lunch. Susan sat alone at the defendant's table, her hands folded tightly in her lap, the collar of her navy wool coat buttoned to her throat. Across from her, her late husband's parents, Mr. and Mrs. Harland, sat in rigid silence, dressed in mourning black. Though their son had died nearly 5 years ago, their attorney spoke first. "She is not the woman she claims to be," he declared. "She forged a new identity, moved the child across state lines, and placed him in an environment without legal or moral oversight. A boy of delicate constitution, being raised among foundry smoke and political scandal." Susan did not flinch. The judge turned to her. "Do you deny any of this, Miss Calloway?" "I do not," she said calmly. "I changed my name to protect my son and myself." There was a murmur from the benches. "From what?" the judge asked. Susan raised her chin. "From grief, from fear, from being silenced." The judge narrowed his eyes. "Do you have legal representation?" Susan shook her head. "No, Your Honor. I could not afford one." A pause. Then, from the back of the courtroom, a chair scraped loudly across the wooden floor. All heads turned. Henry Ashford stood, tall and composed, dressed in a charcoal coat and a deep burgundy cravat. The gallery rippled with whispers as he walked steadily to the front of the courtroom. "I would like to testify," he said, voice ringing clear. The judge blinked. "You are Mr. Henry Ashford?" "I am." "On what grounds do you request to speak?" "On the grounds that I know Miss Calloway's character better than any person in this room." The judge considered him a moment, then gestured to the witness stand. Henry sat with the solemnity of a man giving more than testimony. "Miss Calloway saved a negotiation that could have collapsed my company. She translated not just words, but intent. She has conducted herself with dignity, restraint, and exceptional intellect. I have trusted her with state secrets, foreign delegates, and the full weight of my name." He looked directly at Susan. "And if the court will permit it, I would trust her with my own child." A collective breath shuddered through the room. He turned back to the judge. She is a mother who has sacrificed everything for her son. She has lived in fear, yes, but not from wrongdoing, from the cruelty of those who refuse to see her worth. The judge's pen hovered above his notes. For a moment, the only sound was the creak of the building settling around them. Then he cleared his throat. I will not render a verdict today. This court will review the facts, the statements, and all supplemental materials. A decision will be issued in the coming week. Susan exhaled slowly. The judge stood and left the room. The Harlans gathered their papers and swept out without a word. And Henry remained seated, his gaze fixed on her with the stillness of someone who had not only spoken truth, but laid down a part of his soul in the process. That evening, the sun dipped low behind the rooftops, bleeding gold through the windows of Ashford and Company. The city buzzed beyond, but inside the office, the quiet was sacred. Susan stood by the fireplace in his study, her coat draped over the chair behind her. Her hands twisted gently in front of her, unsure of what to do now that the storm had briefly paused. Henry entered and closed the door behind him. You shouldn't have, she said softly. He crossed the room in 3 measured steps. I wanted to. You risked your name. I gave it freely. She turned toward him, tears shining in her eyes. Why? His voice was barely above a whisper. Because I see you. He stepped closer. Because you have stood alone for too long. Her eyes lifted to meet his. The silence between them swelled, not empty, but full of everything they had felt and never said. When he raised his hand to her face, she did not pull away. His fingers touched her cheek, feather-light. His thumb brushed a single tear away, and then, finally, his lips found hers. The kiss was not rushed nor fierce. It was reverent, quiet. The kind of kiss that speaks of all the moments one dared not hope for. It trembled with gratitude, with sorrow, with a tenderness that seemed to anchor time itself. When they parted, her eyes were still closed. I've never, she began, but could not finish. I know, he said, nor have I. She leaned into him, her forehead resting against his chest. He held her as though she were the only thing left in the world that mattered. And for a moment, it was enough, until the knock, a hesitant, almost apologetic knock at the door. Henry opened it with reluctance. A clerk handed him a telegram, sealed and urgent. He opened it. His eyes scanned the message, then darkened. What is it? Susan asked. He looked at her, his jaw tight. Ward, he said. He's summoned the Russians for a private renegotiation. The warmth between them chilled. Their moment had ended. The war had resumed. The night air around the world's Columbian Exposition shimmered with a deceptive beauty. Lanterns glowed along the lagoon, their reflections trembling upon the water like small captive stars. Towering colonnades framed the pavilions in ivory grandeur, while orchestral music drifted from distant halls, carried on a wind that smelled faintly of roasted chestnuts and wet stone. The white city glowed serene and majestic, yet beneath its elegance, shadows throbbed with deceit. Susan Calloway felt those shadows pressing upon her chest as she hurried down the promenade, her boots striking the pavement with sharp urgency. She clutched a leather folio to her chest. Inside lay the evidence she had uncovered only moments earlier, the final confirmation of Ward's treachery. The wind tugged at her dove-grey coat, loosening strands of hair from her careful twist, but she did not slow. Ahead, the Exposition's grand pavilion loomed. Its arched windows spilled golden light, and silhouettes of men in formal coats moved like restless spirits inside. Russian voices thundered from within, heated and impatient. And at the center of it all stood Jefferson Ward, with his polished smile, his calculating eyes, and his poisonous charm. She had seen the falsified ledgers on his desk. She had gathered the mismatched seals, the forged stamps, the altered figures that pointed to deliberate manipulation. Ward intended to dazzle the Russians with promises of impossible profits and gilded lies, painting Henry Ashford as negligent and incompetent in the process. If he convinced them tonight, the entire negotiation would collapse. and with it, everything she and Henry had fought so fiercely to protect. She reached the pavilion doors just as a Russian delegate raised his voice inside. Why were we not informed earlier? These numbers, these projections, they indicate serious failings. Susan froze for one heartbeat. Then she pushed the doors open. The room fell silent. The Russians, 3 dignitaries in immaculate evening coats trimmed with gold buttons, turned with wide, startled eyes. Ward faced her with the smooth expression of a man who had expected her to appear eventually, though perhaps not quite so boldly. And Henry stood near the large central table, his posture rigid, his jaw clenched, his eyes dark with worry. But when his gaze met hers, the tension in his face flickered in something like relief. Susan stepped into the room, breathless but unafraid. Ward's smile curled. "Miss Calloway, how fortunate you could join us. We were just reviewing financial discrepancies that Mr. Ashford seems unwilling to explain." Henry's eyes narrowed. "She's here because she knows the truth." Susan walked straight to the table and set the folio down with careful deliberation. "These documents," she said, opening the leather cover, "did not come from Ashford and Company. They are forgeries." One of the Russians bristled. "Impossible. They bear your seal." "Look closer," she urged. They did. And as she pointed to each inconsistency with calm precision, the improperly aligned seal, the out-of-date phrasing, the mismatched ink types, she felt Henry move closer to her side, his presence a steady warmth at her shoulder. Ward maintained his composure. "This is ridiculous. She's attempting to distract from her own incompetence. Perhaps she forged them herself." A murmur of unease rippled through the room. Susan lifted her chin. "If I had forged them, why would I bring them to this meeting to expose them? Why would I risk my own reputation when I stand to gain nothing except the truth?" Ward stepped forward. "You stand to gain quite a bit. Protection, employment, a place in the magnate's favor." Henry slammed his hand against the table. "Enough!" The word rang like steel striking stone. Ward froze. The Russians exchanged glances. Henry's voice was low, controlled, and burning with restrained fury. "Miss Calloway has done more for this negotiation than any of us. Her integrity is the only reason we have come this far. If you believe for one moment that she would manipulate, deceive, or forge documents, then you understand nothing of her character." The room shifted. Even the chandeliers seemed to still. Ward recovered with a tight smile. "Character is irrelevant. Facts are what matter." "Then let us speak of facts," Susan said quietly. She reached into the folio and withdrew 2 documents, one from Ward's false report and one she had found hidden among his papers. "These pages," she said, laying them side by side, "contain identical errors, identical handwriting, and identical mathematical inconsistencies, errors that do not appear in legitimate Ashford records." She pointed to the margin of one page. "This symbol here, the one that looks like a stylized flourish at the end of a figure, is a mark used by Ward's personal clerk. A clerk who resigned last month without explanation." One of the Russians leaned closer, his face tightening. "You are saying Ward fabricated the ledgers?" "I am saying," Susan replied steadily, "that Ward intended to mislead you into believing Ashford and Company is unstable, so that he could position himself as your savior. He hoped to seize control of the partnership by orchestrating chaos." Ward laughed, but the sound was brittle, weak. "This is insanity." Henry glared at him. "Is it?" For the first time, Ward's expression shifted ever so slightly, from arrogance to unease. The Russians conferred with one another in hurried whispers, their brows furrowed. The eldest among them, a stern man with a thick silver mustache, looked between Henry and Susan with a penetrating gaze. "This situation," he said slowly, "is most troubling. But even with evidence of deceit, there is concern. We cannot attach our nation's investment to a company embroiled in scandal." Henry prepared to speak, but Susan stepped forward. "Please," she said. Her voice was soft, but the room fell silent. She clasped her hands before her, grounding herself in the memory of every man she'd seen at the mill, every child playing in the soot-darkened tenements, every widow who had stood where she once had, torn, afraid, uncertain. "The work you are considering," she said, looking each delegate in the eye, "is not about numbers alone. It is about people. Fathers and sons who carry iron on their shoulders, mothers who scrub their hands raw so that their children may eat, workers who risk their lives beneath machines that do not care whether they return home." Her voice trembled with quiet conviction. When a forged document blames them for a collapse, it is not only a lie, it is an insult to their sacrifice. When a man like Ward attempts to twist truth into profit, it is not business. It is cruelty. And when leaders must choose between wealth and honor, it is the workers who bleed. Henry watched her, his expression unreadable but full of something so deep it almost frightened her. Susan continued, "Do not let deceit dictate the fate of this alliance. Do not let fear overshadow integrity. If you need time to consider, take it. But do not decide the future of hundreds of families based on lies." Silence. Then, slowly, the eldest Russian nodded. "We will deliberate further," he said. "This is too important to settle tonight." He gathered the documents, including the forged ones, and tucked them into his case. "We will announce our decision at the public ceremony 2 days from now." Ward blanched. Henry exhaled, shoulders relaxing for the first time that evening. The Russians offered curt farewells and exited into the night. When the doors closed, the room felt suddenly smaller. The chandeliers hummed, the polished floors gleamed. The air carried the faint aroma of extinguished candles. Henry turned to Susan. "What you did had to be done," she whispered. He shook his head. "You saved us." She met his gaze, her breath catching at the intensity in his eyes. "I only told the truth." "Yes," he murmured, "but you told it with courage." Their fingers nearly brushed. Nearly. But the moment broke when footsteps echoed in the hallway. Ward. He stood in the doorway, pale with fury, his eyes burning like embers smothered beneath ash. "You will regret this," he hissed. Henry stepped between him and Susan. "I've had enough of your threats." Ward looked at them both, something dark and calculating behind his gaze. "This isn't over," he said. Then he vanished into the shadows of the pavilion. Susan released a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Henry turned back to her, his expression softening. "You were extraordinary." Her cheeks warmed. He touched her hand lightly. "You were extraordinary," he repeated. She lowered her gaze to steady herself. Because there, beneath the marble arches of the White City, with the soft glow of lanterns casting gold across Henry's face, she felt the first fragile flicker of hope bloom inside her chest. But hope was as delicate as paper, and the shadows circling them were far from gone. The morning air turned brittle as winter's breath began creeping into the bones of Chicago. Outside Ashford and Company's main offices, a crowd had begun to gather. First a murmur, then a mob. Protesters stood shoulder to shoulder, waving printed broadsheets above their heads like flaming torches. The headlines screamed from every corner stand, from widow to fraud, the true face of Susan Calloway. Ashford's fall, the Russian deal in jeopardy after scandal. Inside, the silence was a weight pressing down on every wall. Henry Ashford stood before the tall windows of his office, his hands clenched behind his back, his gaze locked on the furious sea below. The printing presses had worked through the night, fed by Ward's poison. The article had revealed Susan's former name, her flight from Pennsylvania, the fabricated rumors that she had embezzled funds from her late husband's estate. And worst of all, it portrayed her as a woman who had seduced her way into influence, using Henry's trust as a stepping stone to power. His name was now on every tongue in the city, not in admiration, but in derision. The board had called an emergency meeting. Investors were pulling out of secondary ventures. The Russians, while still formally silent, had requested a postponement of the final signing ceremony, and Susan was gone. No note, no address. Only her desk left bare, her coat missing from the rack in the corridor, and Daniel's school reporting he had been withdrawn that very morning. Henry had scoured every corner of the house where she boarded. He had sent word to every safe house he could think of, but he knew this was Susan's way of protecting them. Her silence was not cowardice. It was love. Behind him the door creaked open. Edwin Carter, his most senior legal aid, stepped in with hesitant steps. "We trace the source," Edwin said, holding a document gingerly in his gloved hands. Ward used a proxy printer, but one of the ledgers left a watermark from his own office seal. Henry turned, his eyes sharp. "You're certain?" "Yes, sir. And there's more. The article cites a sealed court record, a record that's still officially locked. Ward had to falsify a judicial release form. He committed fraud to access sealed files." Henry reached for the papers with steady fingers. As he scanned the page, something within him, some quiet corner that had endured this storm, ignited. He had begged Susan to stay. He had tried to reassure her that the truth would prevail, but she had seen only risk. And yet, if he allowed her name to be dragged through the mud without a fight, then he would have become exactly what his critics claimed, another powerful man willing to let a woman fall to protect his own legacy. He would not be that man. "I want a platform built," Henry said quietly, "at the Exposition by the main rotunda. Have it done before dusk." Edwin blinked. "Sir, the Russians will be there," Henry interrupted. "They need to see who we are, and so does the city." He glanced out the window once more. "Tell the press." The aide hesitated. "What should I tell them?" Henry looked him in the eye. "That I have something to say." That evening, as twilight fell over the White City, a stage was erected in the plaza beside the Grand Basin. Torches were lit. The gold-domed roof of the administration building gleamed in the firelight, while whispers rushed through the swelling crowd like wind through dry leaves. Henry Ashford took the stage as jeers rose from the edges of the square. He stood beneath the arch of a banner that had once proclaimed unity and progress and now trembled with the weight of accusation. He wore no overcoat, no gloves, just his black suit, pressed and simple, and the red scarf Susan had once complimented. A flicker of defiance wrapped around his throat. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying over the plaza, firm and calm, "you have read much today." The murmurs quieted slightly. "You have read that I was fooled, that I entrusted my business to a fraud, that I allowed my judgment to be clouded by the presence of a woman." He paused. "Every word you've read was designed not to reveal truth, but to destroy it." A few scattered scoffs, but mostly silence. Henry continued. "Susan Calloway was born under a different name, yes, a name she discarded not to deceive but to survive. After the death of her husband, her son was nearly taken from her by those who believed that a grieving woman had no right to independence. She fled, not because she had committed a crime, but because she had dared to live on her own terms." The silence thickened. She worked in a cafe. She served coffee to diplomats and janitors alike. And when the moment came, when a foreign deal that could shape this city's future hung in the balance, she stepped forward, with no promise of reward, with no calculation of gain. She saved this partnership. She saved me. The crowd listened. Henry's voice deepened. "Those who fear a woman's voice will always seek to discredit her. They will dig through ashes looking for dirt, and when they find none, they will invent fire." He opened his coat and pulled out the printed article. "This report is built on falsified documents and a contract forged by Jefferson Ward, a man who now hides behind journalists and whispers." A rustle in the audience. A man in a grey coat slipped away through the back of the crowd. Henry raised his hand. "I have made many decisions in my life, some for profit, some for pride, but none with the clarity of this one." He turned slightly, as if pulled by instinct. And there, at the edge of the platform, stood Susan. She had stepped from the shadows like a memory made flesh. She wore her old coat, the hem dusted from travel, and a pale blue ribbon pinned at her throat. Her hair was drawn back in a modest twist, and her eyes, those steady, storm-touched eyes, were fixed only on him. Henry's breath caught. He extended his hand. She stepped forward slowly, and the moment her fingers touched his, something shifted in the square. The tension fractured, the crowd hushed. A ripple passed like light across still water. Henry turned back to the people. "I stand beside Susan Calloway not because I pity her or because she is convenient, or even because she is brave. I stand beside her because I admire her, because she is the finest partner I have ever had, and because she reminds me every single day that integrity is not a name or a title or a fortune. It is a choice." There was no applause. Not yet. Just silence. Then a movement near the front. The Russian delegation stepped forward. The elder delegate, silver-haired, solemn, raised the contract. "In our country," he said in heavy English, "we respect honesty and fire." He dipped the pen and signed. The square erupted in cheers. Susan stood unmoving beside Henry, the firelight catching the tear sliding down her cheek. She turned her face toward him. "You found the truth," she whispered. He didn't let go of her hand. "I found you." And for the first time in days, the White City gleamed, not from gaslight or spectacle, but from something far rarer, a flame that would not be extinguished. The wind had changed. Not in sharpness, for autumn still lingered in every chilled gust that swept off Lake Michigan, but in something deeper, an undercurrent of stillness, of resolution. The world's Columbian Exposition, once ablaze with electric wonder and dreams carved in white plaster, now shimmered with the last breath of glory. Susan stood by the grand rotunda of the administration building, her gloved hands resting on the iron railing of the terrace. From here, she could see the court of honor stretching outward, golden domes catching the weak morning light. Banners still fluttered from the columns, but fewer now. The crowds had thinned. The laughter of tourists had grown quieter, subdued by the looming end of the fair. But in her chest, something new bloomed, a quiet certainty. Behind her, the courtroom ruling had been read with finality. The judge, having reviewed every petition, testimony, and document, had granted her full legal custody of Daniel. The name on the certificate bore no footnote, no asterisk of suspicion, only her truth. Her in-laws had not attended the final hearing. Rumors swirled that Ward's public disgrace had frightened them into withdrawal. Whatever the reason, their silence was a gift she would not question. As Susan turned from the view, she saw Daniel racing along the path, cheeks pink with cold, his wool coat flapping open as he ran toward Henry. The boy's laughter rang out across the square, a sound more brilliant than any exhibit. Henry bent to catch him, lifting him easily in strong arms. His overcoat was dusted with morning frost, his hair tousled by the wind, but his smile, so rare, so unguarded, was radiant. He looked up, catching Susan's eye. "Your son," he called, "has decided he wants to climb every statue in the park before breakfast." She descended the steps toward them, heart full. "Then he takes after someone bold," she said, her voice soft but steady. Henry set Daniel down, letting the boy run toward the reflecting pool, where his image danced over the rippling surface. They stood in companionable silence for a long moment. "I could give you a home," Henry said, not looking at her. "I have one," she replied gently. "Wherever Daniel sleeps safe, and I can look at the world without fear, I have that." He turned then, his expression earnest. "No," he said, "I mean a life. A name, not as my guest, not as my housekeeper or interpreter. I want you as you are, unhidden, equal, with your name restored and mine beside it if you'll have it." Susan felt the words settle into her bones. She had never needed a man to rescue her. But this was not rescue. It was recognition. It was a man offering to walk beside her, not ahead. She nodded, eyes bright. "I will." The ceremony was quiet, as they had wished. held beneath the arched marble colonnade of the Woman's Building, a place that had honored female invention, strength, and endurance. There were no trumpets, no garlands, only truth. Susan wore a slate blue gown trimmed with ivory lace, the same hue as the lake beneath a grey sky. Her hair, for once, was unbound at the nape, soft curls framing her cheeks. She held no bouquet, she needed no veil. Her hands trembled only when Henry took them in his. He wore his navy coat, tailored and simple, a burgundy pocket square tucked into the breast, a whisper of the scarf he had worn on the night he stood for her. Daniel stood between them, one hand in each of theirs. The officiant spoke plainly, without embellishment. Vows were exchanged with quiet voices, but each syllable struck with the weight of everything they had endured. When it was done, there was no applause, just a hush like snowfall. As dusk crept over the white city, the three of them walked the length of the Midway Plaisance. The lights had begun to dim, the power slowly withdrawn from the grand bulbs that had bathed the city in artificial day for so many months. Booths were closing, flags were lowered, but to Susan it felt not like an ending, but a beginning lit by the embers of resilience. She watched Henry walk beside Daniel, his hand on the boy's shoulder, their footsteps matched. She followed at a slight pace behind, content to observe for a moment longer before joining them. She thought of everything the city had tried to promise: progress, wonder, possibility. She had once thought herself too small for such things, but now she knew. Those promises belonged not to the powerful, but to the brave, to women who stepped forward in silence when voices failed, to men who changed, to children who slept without fear, unaware of the battles fought for their peace. At the far end of the avenue, the three of them stopped. The great wheel still turned slowly above them, casting long shadows over the fairgrounds. Susan looked up at Henry. "Do you think it will all be torn down?" He followed her gaze. "Perhaps. It was always meant to be temporary." She took his hand. "Then we'll build something better." And as the last lights flickered out across the lagoon, a new glow lit their path. Not electric, not fleeting, but enduring. Like ash that still burns, like fire that refuses to die, like love, not easy, not clean, but earned, and forever. 5 years later, Chicago, spring of 1898. The world had grown quieter. The white city was gone, dismantled beam by beam, plaster by pillar. Where once rose domes of brilliance and colonnades of ambition, now there were parks, trees planted by city hands, and the occasional bench where the elderly came to feed pigeons or recall a fair they once walked beneath gaslight and wonder. But just north of the lake's curve, on a quiet stretch of land untouched by tracks or towers, stood a modest stone house with ivy growing wild along its porch railings. The wind carried the scent of lilacs and turned the curtains inside the parlour in gentle sighs. Susan Ashford stood at the open window, a mug of chicory in her hand, her free arm gently cradling the weight of a sleeping infant against her shoulder. The boy, just shy of 4 months, had Henry's brows and her mouth, and a way of furrowing his face when he dreamed, as if already puzzled by the world. His name was Samuel. She turned at the sound of light footsteps behind her. "Daniel's finished his Latin," Henry said, stepping into the parlour with sleeves rolled to his elbows and spectacles perched low on his nose. "He's gone outside to fly the kite." Susan smiled. "If the wind doesn't carry him off with it." Henry approached and kissed the top of her head, lingering just long enough to breathe her in. "You still smell like coffee," he whispered. "Old habits." She leaned into him, careful not to wake Samuel. They stood together in silence, husband and wife, mother and father, survivors of fire and scandal, betrayal and redemption. Time had not dulled their bond, it had tempered it. Like iron made stronger through flame, much had changed in 5 years. Ward had never recovered from his public disgrace. His holdings were sold off to settle debts, and he vanished into the obscurity of a boarding house in New Jersey. No charges had been brought, Too many hands had benefited from his fall, but his name, once feared, was now spoken only with pity. Susan's name, by contrast, had become something entirely different. She was now a published essayist. Her article in The Independent, The Language of Power on Women, Truth and the Right to Speak, had been republished across the Northeast. Her quiet dignity, once dismissed, had become a voice others listened for. The Ashford Foundation, formed in the wake of the Russian deal, now funded education for mill workers' daughters. Susan's idea, Henry's money. Daniel's childhood drawings served as the seal on their pamphlets. The boy had grown tall, lean, thoughtful. 11 now. He still had nightmares sometimes, ghosts of courtrooms and whispered threats, but he always came to their bed and found the comfort of arms that never faltered. And Samuel. Samuel had arrived like a benediction, not planned, not expected, but wanted with a fierceness that surprised them both. The front door creaked open, and Daniel's voice echoed through the hallway. "Papa, the strings tangled in the oak again," Henry groaned. "That tree will be the death of me." Susan laughed softly, shifting Samuel in her arms. "Go. He needs you." Henry brushed a kiss on her cheek. "So do you." She touched his hand. "I always will." He stepped out into the sunlight, his laughter joining Daniel's as they disappeared into the field behind the house. Through the window, Susan watched them. Father and son, kite and sky, roots and flight. She looked down at the baby, who blinked open, drowsy eyes. "You're too young to remember what we lived through," she murmured, rocking gently. "But you'll feel it somehow. In the safety of your home, in the strength of your name, in the fire we never let die." The wind stirred again, carrying with it the distant whistle of a train, the cry of gulls above the lake, and the scent of new beginnings. And inside the house at the edge of the world, a woman once accused, once silenced, once lost, now stood as something far greater, loved, seen, home, and always, always unafraid. Did this story move you the way it moved us? Because Susan's journey was never just about a tycoon and a waitress. It was about resilience in the face of injustice, about the quiet power of truth, about choosing to stand tall even when the world tries to silence you. Through scandal and fire, through whispered doubts and public shame, Susan never stopped fighting for her son, for her voice, and finally, for a love built not on power or wealth, but on mutual respect. And isn't that what we all long for? If you made it all the way to the end of this unforgettable love story, type the word ashes in the comments. It will let us know that you, too, believe that from ruin, something even stronger can rise. We'd love to hear what touched you most. Was it Susan's bravery? Henry's transformation? The kiss in the courtroom? Leave a comment. We read every single one. If this story left a mark on your heart and you'd like to support the small team that brings these romantic journeys to life, you can now send us a super thanks here on YouTube. Whatever amount you choose, no matter how small, makes a big difference. It helps us keep telling these powerful, timeless stories, and if you're not in a place to support us financially right now, that's perfectly okay. Just sharing this video with a friend, a sister, a mother, someone who loves sweeping love stories as much as you do, means the world to us. Make sure to check out the other Gilded Age romances we've left for you in the end cards. Each one carries the same heart, same drama, same timeless magic. Thank you for walking through the White City with us. And remember, true love doesn't always come easy, but when it arrives, it's worth everything.